Good afternoon. Welcome. Some of you may know me. My name is Jeff Jenkins. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics at UVA, and I'm also a faculty associate in the Gage program here at the Miller Center. And I'm very pleased to be moderating the Gage Colloquium today. And our guest is Professor Suzanne Mettler from Cornell University. She is the Clinton Rossiter Professor of American Institutions. She conducts research and teaches on American politics and public policy. Her most recent book, which I have right here, and it's only been out for a couple weeks, called The Submerged State: How Invisible Government Programs Undermine American Democracy, was published on the University of Chicago Press. The paper that she'll be presenting today, Who Perceives Government's Role in Their Lives, How Policy Visibility Influences Awareness of and Attitudes About Social Spending, is an extension of this book. And just before we move on, I just want to give a couple highlights. Earlier books include Dividing Citizens, Gender and Federalism and New Deal Public Policy on Cornell University Press, Soldiers to Citizens, the GI Bill, and the Making of the Greatest Generation on Oxford University Press. Both books won several prizes. She's co-editor with Joe Soss and Jacob Hacker of Remaking America, Democracy and Public Policy in an Age of Inequality, and that's for the Russell Sage Foundation. She's a co-editor with Larry Jacobs of a special issue of journal Health Policy, Politics, and Law that's coming out in the next couple of months. She's published a number of articles in some of the best journals in political science. I can go on and on, but that'd be cutting more into our time. So I'll just say that Professor Mettler will have about 20 minutes to give you an overview of this paper and the project in general. And once she's done, I'll turn things over to my colleague in the politics department, Professor Lynn Sanders, who will provide some commentary on Professor Mettler's paper. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Mettler. And she's going to use the podium. We're doing PowerPoint today.
All right. Thank you for coming today, and I want to thank everyone who invited me here. It's always a pleasure to come back to the University of Virginia and to Charlottesville. You have such a beautiful place. The sun always seems to be shining when I'm here. The hospitality and friendliness is wonderful, and the intellectual environment is so stimulating. So thank you for coming today and for having me here. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background first, and to talk for a few minutes about this book, which is just out, because telling you that will help to explain sort of the rationale and motivation for this new paper that I've done with Juliana Koch that I'm presenting today. So last winter, I just completed the manuscript for this short book, The Submerged State: How Invisible Government Policies Undermine American Democracy. And let me give you a little postage stamp kind of sketch of what it's about. When we think of public policy, we tend to think of government itself as the primary actor, offering goods and services to people, or perhaps coordinating with the states to do so. But as your own Brian Balow has shown us so well, that's not the only way or even the predominant way that we govern in the United States. And we have a long history of what he's called government out of sight. Now, with coining the term the submerged state, what I'm referring to is a particular manifestation of this. I'm referring to the kinds of policies that, when you receive them, you don't really interact much with government in a direct way and receive goods and services from them. Government doesn't send you a check, typically, for these kinds of policies, but instead, they work either through the tax code, and you get to pay less in taxes, you owe less in taxes as a result, through what are called tax expenditures, and or they work through subsidies to private organizations, which in turn give benefits to people, to families and households. Now, I would note that I'm focusing on social welfare policies, very broadly conceived. There are many other ways in the United States in which we use what could be called the submerged state, and you might think of other examples of those, but I'm going to focus on those in the social welfare domain. So the largest examples of these today are the tax-exempt status of employer-provided health insurance and retirement benefits. And this occurs, their tax-exempt status occurs through policy developments that came about during World War II and that were formalized, signed into law by President Eisenhower, confirming that people would not have to pay taxes on these benefits, which is a government subsidy. The other of the top three most expensive of these policies is the home mortgage interest deduction. Now, the number of these kinds of policies has doubled since 1980, and they currently add up to more than $1 trillion per year, or 7.4% of GDP. So that's more than Social Security, which is currently about 5% of GDP, or Medicare and Medicaid combined, which are about 5% of GDP. And it's much more than corporate tax breaks, which tend to get more attention in the media. There's been recent attention, for example, to the cost of oil and gas subsidies through the tax code. But all of those corporate tax breaks add up to less than 1% of GDP by comparison to these social tax expenditures, as they're called. And based on my survey data, the use of these types of policies is just about as common among Americans and pervasive as more direct forms of social provision. Most of these policies, furthermore, shower their largest benefits on the most affluent Americans. By contrast to our usual conception of social welfare benefits, they're upwardly redistributive. And furthermore, they benefit powerful industries by lowering the costs for consumers of purchasing their goods and services. As a result, the interest groups representing these industries are very well organized and always ready to defend the status quo. They make plentiful campaign contributions to candidates on both sides of the aisle and engage in extensive lobbying to maintain these benefits. But citizens themselves have little awareness of these policies, even when they themselves utilize them. And that's why I call them submerged. I'm particularly interested in citizens' perceptions of these policies and the impact that has on people's ability, or lack thereof, to form opinions about them that are meaningful, or to take action on them and to voice their preferences. And what they mean is that we have a substantial amount of government spending that occurs without citizens' consent, and it ratchets up our deficits and exacerbates inequality, and worst of all, to my mind, undermines democracy. So that's what I grapple with in this book, and what I do is lay out these trends that I'm describing to you, and then I investigate using survey data the impact of these policies compared to that of direct visible policies on citizens' attitudes about government. And then I use experimental data to look at if we gave people a little bit more information about these policies and how they work, what would the outcome be? And I find that then with just even a little bit of information, people are able to form attitudes about them, and they're attitudes that make sense given those individuals' values and interests. And then I engage in some case studies from the first 2 years of the Obama presidency on healthcare reform, tax policy, and student aid policy that illustrate how these submerged policies that exist present challenges and obstacles to reform, and I derive some lessons for future reformers. So in a nutshell, that's what I do. So in the book, and I'd had an article that preceded the book, and it had this table in it. Now, you're not going to be able to see this so well, but in a few minutes I'll show you a version of it that you can see better. But I wanted to show you this just to tell a little story about it. This table has gotten more attention than everything else I've done combined in my life as a scholar. It was really kind of amazing. So what happened was that last February, I got this phone call from a reporter for The Nation wanting to interview me about something she'd seen on a blog and about my work. And I thought, wow, that's really bizarre. And I just couldn't imagine, my work being discussed in the blogosphere. So, and then, and I didn't know what she was talking about, but I answered some questions about my research. And then by later in the day, former grad students of mine were cluing me into what was going on and let me know that the Monkey Cage blog, which is a political science blog, Henry Farrell there had discussed this table. And so then it started to go viral, and it was going, to blogs all over the place. And other former grad students would write to me from, around the country, and they'd say, you're all over my friends' Facebook pages and everything. This was really wild for me because, as my 20-year-old would tell you, I'm quite a Luddite when it comes to these things. So this was really quite a surprise. And then I was interested to see what everyone was saying about this table. Now, this table, let's see. I know it's hard for you to see it. I'm going to, what I'm showing in this table is the results, very basic results, descriptive statistics from a survey I did in 2008. The first question in that survey, which was to a national random sample of 1,400 Americans, the first question was, have you ever used a government social program, yes or no? Then later in the survey, we asked people whether they had used any of 21 specific social policies. Have you ever used Social Security? Have you ever used unemployment insurance? Have you ever used the home mortgage interest deduction, and so forth and so on? Yes or no? And so all that this table is the cross tabulations between the results of those two kinds of questions. So what was interesting was that the people up top, and their policies in italics, that's all the policies in the tax code and student loans that also work through what I call the submerged state. A very high percentage of recipients of those policies said up front, no, I've never used a government social program. So I was trying to highlight the submerged state aspect. What interested people who were writing in the blogs and reporters who called me up was that even policies like Social Security and Medicare have a pretty high percentage of people. I mean, they're kind of in the middle of the list, but they have a pretty high percentage of recipients who said up front, no, I've never used a government social program. So, this is intriguing, particularly in an era of the Tea Party and a lot of people who are saying, we want less government, but are still benefiting from it themselves, these kind of paradoxes. So what did it all mean? Well, Juliana Koch and I were geared and ready to be doing some further exploration of this data, and we decided to focus in on this question, to look at how people answer the question of, have you ever used a government social program? Okay, and that's what this paper is about. So we're trying to build here on policy feedback scholarship. And the idea of policy feedback is that policies, once established, shape future politics. They can shape it among individuals and among interest groups. And my focus in my previous work on this is about how once people have benefited from particular policies, how that might reshape their political attitudes or participation. So here, what we're trying to do is to look at how policy feedback dynamics, aspects of the design of these policies and their delivery might influence how people think about this question of receiving a government social program. And what we're explicitly looking at is ideas that Paul Pierson at Berkeley wrote about quite a while ago now in an article back in 1993, where he said that for policies to have feedback effects, they need to be visible and traceable to government. So we're trying to look here at how the degree of visibility of policies might affect people's attitudes about them. And our hypothesis is that individuals who benefit from the submerged policies will be less likely to consider themselves recipients of a government social program than the individuals who benefit from more direct policies. So that's what we're setting out to test. And then we wanted to qualify that a bit. And here we're drawing on another theory that comes from Chuck Tabor and some of his associates about motivated reasoning or partisan bias. In this very partisan, polarized age, and when we have fragmented media, Tabor finds that people tend to interpret new information that comes to them through particular lenses that they're already wearing that have to do with their prior beliefs, their political ideology, and their partisan identification. And so we hypothesized that individuals who are more supportive of government social provision in terms of their partisan identity and ideology will be more likely to say up front that they have received a government social program. That's what we expected as well. Now let me show you first a few of the descriptive statistics from this survey. And this survey, as I said, I did in 2008. The Cornell Survey Research Institute conducted it. It was a telephone survey. And so what we found going through the 21 policies that people were asked about, had they ever used them, in fact, there were only 4% of all respondents who said no to every single question about have you used any of these programs. And in fact, 65% of the respondents had used 4 or more policies. The average number of benefits that people had received across ever, and this is, have you ever received these, was 4.22, and that was divided between direct benefits, with the average person saying yes to 1.94, and submerged benefits 2.53. So the submerged were even a little bit more prevalent than the direct. But the interesting thing was that, overall, up front, this very first question in the survey, have you ever used a government social program, 57% of the people responded no to that. So, that's really interesting. Only 43% said yes. Now, of those who said no, when we look down into the data, we find that 68% of them have used at least one direct program. And if you count direct and submerged programs, 94% of them have used at least one at some point. So now Juliana and I redid this table that I showed you earlier and put it in graph form as a bar graph and actually flipped it upside down. So the submerged benefits are down where you would expect they would be under the water here. And so the submerged benefits, as you can see, those are benefits for which in most of them, it's more than half of the beneficiaries, all of them except the EITC, more than half of the beneficiaries said, no, I've never used a government social program. And then we have the most visible benefits up top. Now, looking at them more carefully, what occurred to me was that these most visible benefits are all ones that require people to interact more intensively with government in order to establish their eligibility and to maintain their eligibility or to get their benefits over time. So government becomes more evident to them, I think, in the course of receiving these policies. The partly visible benefits are really interesting because, like I said, here you have Medicare and Social Security and others. And what I would say is that I think each of these policies that are in the middle of the heap have some characteristics that can camouflage their status as a government benefit to some beneficiaries. So for example, Medicare these days, 1 out of 4 beneficiaries has been, as of last year, was receiving it through their private insurance company. They've had the option to do that since about the 1970s. And so the person who, the quote that is so often named of get the government out of my Medicare, that person might actually have had good reason to have the perception that it was a private policy, not a public, if in fact he was receiving it through his private insurance company, even though it was government benefits. With Social Security, I think back to how when this program was created, Roosevelt insisted that it should be financed through payroll taxes, giving people the perception that it is an earned right of theirs. And he said that way, no damned politician is ever going to do away with my Social Security program, because he knew that it would give people the strong belief that it was an earned right of theirs and not something that could be taken away. So now we wanted to proceed to do our analysis. And here we're trying to grapple with a problem that often confronts scholars of policy feedback, which is the issue of selection bias or endogeneity. And this is what I mean. It could be that people who use a particular policy are different from other Americans in the first place in some way, and that difference in turn down the road shapes their political attitudes and their participation. So we might think that it's the intervention of the policy that made a difference, when in fact it was some pre-existing characteristics. That's the endogeneity possibility. So in order to try to deal with that, what Juliana and I did was we set up a two-stage model, where first we look at what are the determinants of use of a policy, and then we save the predicted values of that from our analysis, and we use it in the second stage with combining it with analysis of some other people's other characteristics that might in turn shape their attitude of, have you ever used a government social program? So that's what we do here are the arrows. This is my Juliana, she's my grad student. She knows how to do all these things with the arrows, so she gets credit for that. So what we're seeing in stage one is that here we're looking at these demographic indicators that we think of as determinants of policy usage, whether you use a great sum of visible direct benefits or whether you use a great sum of submerged benefits, okay? And those are our dependent variables in that case for that first stage. And we do it in both ways, looking at visible and submerged. And then we save those, and then we combine them with some of these other kinds of variables like ideology and partisanship and opinion about welfare, and we look at the determinants of how people answer, yes, I've ever used a government social program. So now, looking at stage one to see what are the determinants of usage of either a great sum of direct benefits, that's our first model, and the second model looks at using the greater sum of submerged benefits. This was interesting. What we found, first of all, is that determinants of using a larger number of direct benefits had to do with age and income and race. People who were older were more likely to have said that they had used more of these policies across time. People who were lower income had used more of them, and African Americans had used more of them. So these were the significant determinants. When we looked at the submerged benefits, however, by contrast, here there's a different group of people. They were significantly higher income, more highly educated, younger, and non-Hispanic. Now, I should say, and we'll be delving into this data more over the course of time, most Americans have used at least one of each of these policies, direct and submerged. So it's not that we have two entirely separate populations that use these different kinds of benefits. But the general characteristics of people are different. And the different association with those who have used many of these submerged policies versus many of the direct, which suggests to us that different groups of people have really different experiences of government overall. So then we look at the second stage, stage two, and we look at what are the determinants of how you answer this question: have you ever used a government social program? And here, as we expected, as we hypothesized, when we look at the, if you see the first column, direct benefits, are the variable about the predicted values of the sum of direct policies you've ever used ends up being highly significant. People who had used more of those policies were more likely to say, yes, I've used a government social program. Not surprising. It was also the case that people who were liberal ideologically, who defined themselves as extremely liberal, were much more likely to say, yes, I've used a government social program, than conservatives were, even when they'd used the same number of policies. Compare two individuals who'd used the same number of policies over time, but one's liberal, one's conservative. The liberal will say yes, the conservative will say no. And similarly, we looked at welfare opinion. Now, here's why we did this. This particular question, we ask people, have you ever used a government social program? That could be a pejorative term to a lot of people and have particular connotations. And people might use different language to refer to these policies. But we thought that it might matter how people think about welfare spending. If people are opposed to more welfare spending, we thought they might be people who, we're using that as a proxy for disapproving of programs that may be identified in a pejorative way with government social programs. And we find that indeed people who have more favorable attitudes about more welfare spending are more willing to say, yes, I've used a government social program. And those, and partisanship did not matter, by the way. It was not significant. And we get those same results when we look at the submerged benefits model. But what's really interesting here, and this surprised us, was that here we got a highly significant negative result for use of the sum of submerged policies. In other words, the more of these submerged policies you had used, the more likely you were to say, no, I've never used a government social program. We expected just non-results to this. And in fact, it was highly negative, which is intriguing. And you know, I would invite you to think about what that might suggest, that people's accumulated experiences, how they lead them to that conclusion. Okay, so I've gone on for plenty of time, so I'm going to skip over this next little part and just conclude now. So what we have found through this paper is that people's awareness of government's role in social provision is affected by both policy design and delivery, and also by their ideology and their views about and their association of government social programs with stigma, or this kind of welfare proxy that I was mentioning. We also, later in the paper, we look at how people's experiences of visible programs affects their support for government social spending. And so I haven't had time to go into that, but we find some support for the idea that those who've used more of the visible programs are in turn more willing to support other kinds of social programs for the general population, whereas we found that those who've used more of the submerged policies are not willing to extend that support for other kinds of policies. So, you know, it makes me think, and I'll be, you know, pondering this into the future, that in contemporary governance, we like to use market mechanisms for public policies, but I think that when we do that, we're giving people particular messages that, that convey to them that whatever they have, they've gotten it through their own efforts or through the market, but government's role in providing for those benefits, which is extremely costly to the nation, it's all hidden. And so people don't realize that, in fact, government has helped them to have the level of economic security or educational opportunity or whatever that they may have. Thank you.
Okay, if I can figure out how to turn this back on. All right, so you can see that? Yes? Okay, ready to go. So a lot of what I want to talk about is that part you just skipped over. So, but maybe that's good, because then we'll have a way to talk about that kind of indirectly. Let me emphasize, especially by just repeating the title of Suzanne Mettler's paper here in this first line in this PowerPoint, how important I think the question is. And it's a really, as I wrote, it's a fabulous question. It's an awesome question. And I want to review some of the reasons it's great. And so in the paper itself, there is a lot of attention to the policy feedback literature, which is an important step in political science and in American politics broadly, because of the way it brings two pretty distinct domains of study and scholarship together. That is, institutional, historical, developmental, and broad sociological, political things in the world, and the way that individuals think. Habitually, political scientists separate those questions. Different kinds of people address those questions, people with different training, people who go to different graduate schools. So they tend not to get addressed together. But of course, they should be addressed together. And of course, we should be more vigorous and more attentive about trying to get that conjunction going. And this paper does it. You can see it in that sentence. You've got a reference to government, to that big, broad, developmental, historical, environmental stuff. And you've got a reference to the most micro, narrow, inside the head element of political psychology, the perception reference. If there's anything that I want to suggest could be pushed further in the paper / improved, it would be to stay focused more on perception. And that's actually what you stray away from in the little part that you skipped, right? So you actually move, you actually don't have that variable in, you don't have perception in those last tables at all. I think that the attention in this paper itself should be focused, as the attention in the blogosphere was. Why did people love that table? Why did you probably see it on the Monkey Cage or maybe in the Washington Post or any of the other places where it was reproduced? Why did you hear about it? Because it's so stunning that we think that individuals can be recipients of tax breaks and tax benefits and government programming itself and not understand themselves to be receiving those benefits. And so that's a political psychology question and a government question. And it's really what we want to explain. How does that psychological phenomenon occur? And this language, are submerged benefits perceived as social benefits emanating from government? That is the question. That's language that also comes out of the Koch and Mettler paper. I don't know how that happened. It was a nice figure to appear, so that was, I think, yeah. So, yeah, governments in all our lives. So, all right, now, to try to keep that attention, I wanted to just actually review a confusion I had when I was reading the paper. I kept getting really confused between perception awareness, visibility, and what's kind of outside the individual and what's inside. So to be a little more specific, I just want to trace some pieces of what the model involves. So the question, who perceives government's role in their lives? Let's just remember that perception often is referred to as awareness both in our ordinary language and also in your paper. So that's really awareness of whether one received a benefit from government. This is where I kept getting confused, because when something is visible to someone, then we perceive it. So I kept confusing visibility in my reading of the paper. I kept confusing it with perception. But when something is visible, that does not necessarily mean that we perceive it, but it is a factor that produces perception or variation in perception. That is, when we try to explain when people notice that they're getting a benefit, it depends on lots of things that are in the paper and in the model. Background ideology, some demographic factors, a lot of stuff, but one of the things it depends on is how visible the programs are. So that's the key policy feedback claim. Awareness depends on visibility, and a little more detail in this, a reference to the sort of familiar elements of the policy feedback literature. Visibility varies with policy design. So how you get your benefits, whether your insurance company is who you encounter when you're getting your Medicare or not, that is that's visibility, and that varies. And I just walked over that again or stepped it out because it was a place where I got confused. So I wonder, it may just be my idiosyncrasies, but it also may be that could be clarified for other readers too. And I would really, really sharpen this, the distinction between visibility in the sort of environmental policy, historical, institutional domain, and perception. Okay, this is a different and kind of like not as pretty cool iceberg submerged blue version of the figure, and the table that is also figure 1 in the paper, and that Suzanne also projected a few minutes ago in those 3 levels. But I wanted to just review it just to remember what's there. So depending on exactly what analysis you're doing, it might include the last 2 elements or might not, right? So you have different variables for different kinds of submerged credits, but those are the submerged benefits, which are mostly tax credits and some other kinds of benefits as well. And those are just to remember the stuff that we're talking about, and then the stuff that's sort of in the middle, the emergent stuff or the partly visible stuff. Those are those programs. Just so again we know the programs that we're talking about, and then the familiar welfare state stuff over in the third category. The reason that I, in making these comments, wanted to review those little pieces is because I think that one of the things that you guys might be able to do more, depending on what data you have. Suzanne mentioned that there's a lot more stuff in this data set that she hasn't utilized yet. And so I'm wondering if one of the things that you could utilize more is real detail in each of those program domains. So if you could code for, if you could produce in your equations some kind of, like maybe you could even make a scale on how out of visibility itself, that is, or out of the program design elements, how much do people have to go see directly see government officials? How much time do they spend on the phone? How much time do they spend in offices? Those kinds of factors. So rather than just classify, right now the paper mostly, for the most part, uses these. The variation in the paper is captured by these three categories for the most part, but there might be more nuanced variation that you could get at by doing more analysis of the individual programs, in particular, the way that they vary in the encounters with government officials. So, so I think that that's a place to move to. On a little more on the political psychology question. So this is, I mean, the first thing, and probably a lot of the graduate students, I'm sorry, I'll steal your thunder because you probably want to say this, but it's, so as you heard, that this question, some people, when they think through their life experiences, blah, 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 they report they have used a government social program, others never have used a program. What about you? That's the first question in the survey. So, question ordering effect. So it's hard for people to talk about politics in a survey research context. It's hard for us to even remember who is on the Supreme Court. And I mean, it's hard to make this point to an academic audience because we think we know everything, but ordinary Americans don't know very much about government. They forget it easily. It would be so cool to see what the answers to this question look like after spending half an hour or an hour talking about all the government programs. So if you had a question ordering kind of experiment where this question for some people came at the end of the survey, you'd probably have different results. You might not have as much blogosphere action, but it would probably be really, really different. More modestly, if there were some reminder in the survey of, to help people think, well, what is a government program after all? I mean, what is a government social program? Maybe giving a modest description that doesn't give away the detail of all of those programs. Like if, I know this is a hypothetical because you've already done the survey and you're going to exploit the rest of it that's there that you haven't used yet. But if you could kind of help them a little bit understand, it's possible that people just don't have very much sense of what they're talking about. On the other hand, you've still got variation on the question, which is pretty interesting. So, so that goes against my point a little bit. You're really explaining. What you really want to do is explain variation. All right. So this this slide, and I'm coming to the end of my comments. So don't worry, I'll get there. So this slide refers to the stuff that Suzanne didn't talk about from her paper, and this is the last couple of tables. And this actually turns away from the political psychology question. So, the focus on in the last couple tables in the paper, and the focus in the last part of the paper is to explain the role of receiving submerged or not benefits, or visible or not benefits, in explaining support or opposition to government's role in social welfare spending in general. I think that's a great question, but I think that's the wrong question for this paper. It's not focused enough on the coolest political psychology stuff that's in the paper, and I would actually encourage a different focus in the second part of the paper. So rather than the hypothesis that you're testing, I would want you to change the dependent variable back to the figure 1 variable, back to perception, and look at a large number of other factors that might predict it. And so that's the last slide. One of the things that I think would be really cool would be to flip basically what you, to flip over the table 7 and 8 where you have the policy-ish support questions as dependent variables. I wonder if they should be predictors of that perception. That, after all, is our most interesting thing. How do people get to this point where they think they're not receiving stuff from government? Maybe it's part of their worldview about whether they should support government programs or not. So that's a very, very different kind of model. And I think it's the one that would be really interesting to do. Right now, here's what you're doing. In the first part, this is your model, and I won't belabor this. In the second part, the part you skipped over, these were your dependent variables, support for social welfare spending. I would not do that. I would instead, I wanted to make the point that this is what I expected you to do, but you actually don't even have awareness in your, you're not predicting social welfare spending as a function of the figure 1 variables at all. So you just focus on those last ones. I think here's where you should build. Here's where you should go. You should make the figure 1 question your dependent variable because everybody loves that question. It's so cool. And then really develop a more detailed and depending on what you have in your data set, really build the model out. A couple things that I want to mention that you might say. First 2 points here, when I refer to political behavior and direct system experience, that's boring language for things that are actually really kind of important. Like it would be interesting to just put in whether or not people voted. How connected are they to the system? That's sort of system awareness is a crucial part of policy feedback, especially the psychological side of policy feedback. So we really want to have a lot of focus on those kinds of things. Like, are people connected to the system in broad terms, in broad political terms, like do they vote? I mentioned, do they do stuff like spend time on the phone or have to go down to an office to try to get their benefits? Have they come before a Social Security court judge, magistrate, or whoever those people are called? Have they had those kinds of experiences? Third point, the policytropics idea, when I make that reference is meant to remember the dependent variables from tables 7 and 8. So maybe our broader policy views are ones that shape our perceptions about whether we are government beneficiaries. I know you are thinking about knowledge and information and have addressed it some in your book and want to bring it in more. Final point, racial resentment, not just because it's one thing that's out there, but welfare is a very thin, your welfare measure is a thin candidate, or it's not enough to really capture all of the probable stuff that's feeding into the perceptions. And so you want probably as much moralistic, value-ish, as well as racial attitudes stuff as you can get your hands on to put on the predictor side of your model. All right, that's it. Okay. Okay.
So I want to open it up to questions now from the audience, and we've got a couple microphones that can go around.
So the difference between visible
Can you say who you are, quickly?
My name is Rachel Moran. I'm a Miller Center Fellow. So the difference between visible and invisible benefits is also very much the difference between deserving and undeserving benefits. And I'm wondering how you account for that in your model.
Right. Let's see. I'm actually can I pull up my PowerPoint again? Not sure if that's possible. Okay, thank you. Oops. Oh, here, let's see. Wait, view. Oh, here, slideshow. Yeah, good. That's Juliana. Okay, here we go. The 3 tiers of visibility. Okay, so this is a really good question about is it the deserving, undeserving kind of cleavage that might be operating here. And, you know, it's a good thing to think about. And, you know, you might have some hypotheses about this yourself, which I'd like to hear. One thing that I noticed, I mean, when you look at how these policies line up, is that most of the policies up top are means tested, and then the policies below are mostly not means tested, but it's not entirely the case. It's not a neat division. So for example, we have the earned income tax credit ends up being among the submerged policies. And we have Social Security disability benefits being up among the most visible ones. And so those 2 exceptions actually are really important ones to me because it suggests that the way that the policies align themselves has a lot to do with people's experiences of policy delivery and not just their attitudes about deservingness and undeservingness. And we're trying to control for that attitude about deservingness, undeservingness with that welfare control, kind of the stigma sort of approach. Vita Skocpol has been doing some really interesting work on the Tea Party. She's been studying the Tea Party movement, and she and Vanessa Williamson, her grad student, have a new book coming out on this in a few months. And they've been going around the country and doing interviews, and she's talked to a lot of Tea Party activists, and they will talk about, you know, they are against government programs, and many of them are on Social Security and Medicare. And so she'll probe that, you know, how can you have these 2 attitudes at the same time? And they'll say that they worked hard for their benefits and that they deserve their benefits, and what they're opposed to are policies that, in their perception, are for people who haven't earned them. And they'll talk about their own grandchildren who they think, you know, have not worked hard and who are getting all kinds of benefits, you know, their grandchildren who are grad students, that kind of thing. Yeah, so I think, I mean, that's a very prevalent theme in our society in terms of how people think about benefits, whether they're deserving or undeserving. But I think the way these things line up, that visibility is a very important organizing principle for our perceptions that works independently.
Hi, my name is Maynard Davis, and I have just a simple point of clarification. The driving concept here, or one of the driving concepts, is government social programs as a term. GSP, one could abbreviate it. How was GSP introduced to those 1,400 recipients? Was it embedded in the very first question, or was there any explanation or definition at the beginning of the poll?
Yeah, no, there was no explanation. We hit them cold with this question. You know, it's certainly a term that can mean many things to many people, but I was interested in how people would answer that question. And so, you know, we asked them right away without giving them any explanation of what we meant by it, because, I mean, sort of the standard approach when you do a survey, if the respondent says to the questioner, well, what do you mean by such and such? Then interviewers are instructed to say, whatever it means to you. And that's what we want to know, is based on how you think of the term government social programs, how are you going to answer this question? Have you ever in your life used one or not? Right. And yeah, I could just chat about that for a moment too, based on Lynn's comment. I did want to clarify that while this is, you know, kind of the central focus of this paper, in the book I've written, that's how people answer that question occupies 1 or 2 pages in the book. It's not the whole thing. And I actually have many other ways that I measure, you know, the number of programs that people say they actually used and then how that affects their attitudes. Like, for example, I look at what are the determinants of how people answer the question that when we ask them if they agree that with the statement like, over the course of my life, government has provided me with opportunities. Or another one is, government has given me chances to improve my standard of living. And in those cases, the more direct benefits you've benefited from, the more likely you are to agree. But the greater the number of submerged benefits has no impact on whether you think government's done anything for your standard of living. And it actually has a negative significant impact on your answer to government providing opportunities for you. So there's independent ways that I look at this aside from using government social programs term.
Hi, I'm Martha Williams. I don't know if this is appropriate because you may not be doing anything of a longitudinal nature. I come from a business where perception is reality. I worked in media for 35 years. What I'm wondering is the very famous statement made by Reagan 30 years ago that government is not a solution, it's the problem.
Yes.
I think that had the effect of the butterfly from South America that creates a hurricane in somewhere, because it seemed as though everybody's perception turned on a dime. And I think back to my childhood when the interstate system was being led by Eisenhower, and nobody was complaining, except for the railroads, nobody was complaining about building an interstate system, even though that was a monumental government program. So my question is, you're comparing submerged and more visible items, but what about the longitudinal perspective? I mean, are people just more suspicious about everything that government does than they were 40, 50 years ago?
Yeah.
And have you looked into that at all?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And when I do more with these data in a future book that I'm writing, I actually want to be grappling with that bigger question of looking at this in historical perspective, looking at both changes in our social policies over time, but also changes in the way we talk about government over time and the way that's presented, what the discourse is and what the discussion is, and how that influences people's attitudes about the policies they receive and about social spending generally and so on. I think it's really important, and I actually quote Reagan in the first chapter of this book. I mean, I think that's really important. That's a pivotal moment in the early 1980s of us beginning to talk about government as the problem. And I would say that it's not only conservative leaders since that time that talk about that, but that's become very much our public philosophy, and that Democrats sort of go along with that. And it's in terms of where did this submerged state come from? Well, it has long historical roots, and Christopher Howard and Jacob Hacker, Marie Gottschalk, and other scholars have shown, it's early and mid-20th century, a lot of these policies are created. But what's happened since 1980 is that whereas liberals had been standing on the sidelines previously, and usually these policies came of compromises previously between among moderates. And often there were Southern Democrats originally who were leading the way to create these kinds of policies, and many Republicans. But then increasingly more moderate to liberal Democrats began to go along with it from 1980 to the present, because it became, as one congressman said, the only game in town. And Bill Clinton greatly expanded many of these policies, and Barack Obama has greatly expanded many of these policies. What I think is that it's not that in creating more of the submerged state, people necessarily do it because they're anti-government. It can be politically feasible, but that we don't think about the implications that that has on the attitudes of most Americans and their perception of government's role in their lives. So what it can mean is that while in the short term, yes, it's a strategy that can enable you to create a policy that does more for low to moderate income people, in the long run, you're really hurting the whole project of government.
Right.
Yeah, Brian Bell. I'm a history professor and associate in the Gage program, and I chair the fellowship program here at the Miller Center. If there's any time left, I'll ask my question now. It's a two-part question. One has to do with what you were just talking about, the design of program. To go back to Rachel's question, the very first one, it's hard not to notice the way visible programs map onto perceptions of the undeserving, and invisible programs tend to favor the wealthy. And to what extent, and I know you can't tell this from your survey research, but to what extent are programs aimed at the poor designed in very visible ways, and programs aimed at the wealthy designed to be less visible? The second part of my question really has to do with a bit of a test of whether people are actually aware of their benefits or not. And of course, that always comes when you go to take their benefits away. And I'd like to know what you think the reaction to all those people who think they're not getting a home mortgage deduction it would be if that home mortgage deduction was taken away. Do you think they would not care, not know, feel that they were not a recipient of a home mortgage deduction? Or do you think that they suddenly would say, oh, you know, maybe I do get this government benefit? So, two parts.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so the first question, I've already mentioned that there are some exceptions to the rule about not all of the policies that are most visible are just for poor people. Not all of the policies that are submerged are for middle income to more affluent people. But what I would say is that over, from the Clinton administration and through the Obama administration, there's been an effort to create an increasing number of submerged benefits for low to moderate income people. And so, for example, Obama, he ran on this platform of wanting to create the Making Work Pay tax credit, and that was part of the stimulus bill in 2009. And it was to give a tax break to 95% of working Americans. And then this is where the behavioral economists came into play. They argued that instead of sending people a check, the way George W. Bush had done when we gave people a tax break, you send them a check, you get $400, and it's signed by the president, and you know government did something for you, right? But instead, the behavioral economists said this will do more to stimulate the economy if we dole it out little by little, because if you give people a check, they're likely to save it, and we need to stimulate the economy. And so we want them to spend it a little bit at a time. So in every paycheck, they're going to get to keep a little bit more. So that's how it was administered. So this made, an already rather submerged benefit even more deeply submerged. And so 1 year later, people were asked whether the Obama administration had increased taxes, decreased taxes, or kept them the same, and only 12% knew that taxes had been cut, which is an illustration. And this was benefits for low to moderate income people. And it's become more in vogue, I would say, among Democrats, thinking this is what's politically feasible, this is what we should do to create more of these submerged benefits. And Obama has been most successful in creating those policies. He's tried hard to cut back other aspects of the submerged state, and that's proven very difficult or impossible. But expanding it turns out to be the easier thing to do. But then to your second question, what if we take these benefits away? Will people notice them? Now I want to make one clarifying point. People know that they receive the home mortgage interest deduction, and they know that they get, we asked them in the survey, do you get X, Y, and Z? And so we're dealing with people who said yes. Now, you certainly, someone said to me, it could be that the people who are most informed of the submerged state are accountants. Because if you hand off your taxes to someone else, you may have no idea which benefits you actually receive. Or if someone else in your household does the taxes, probably the rate of people saying yes to those questions is less than what it actually is in terms of people getting the benefits. But people will say they use them, and then we ask them all these follow-up questions with every single policy they say they used about what value it had in their life, and people value these policies. So it's not that they don't think they get it, they just don't think of it as a government social program. And it does not affect their other attitudes about government. Now, but that's all sort of preface to answering your question. So your question is, what if we took the benefits away? Would people be angry and upset about that? I would say that we talk very little about the home mortgage interest deduction. Politicians talk very little about it. And when they do, they make it sound like it benefits middle-income people. Now, most middle-income people get a little something from it, but it turns out that about 70% of the benefits go to the top income quintile. And then, in fact, a very high percentage of the benefits go to the very wealthiest people who have, $1 million mortgages for which they're getting this tax break. What my experiment showed is that if you let people know just a little bit about that upward redistributive kind of bias, that then opposition really grows to the policy among low to moderate income people. And so I think, if political leaders were going to scale back these policies, they would need to engage in providing some information about them, which we don't normally do to the public.
Hi, I'm Emily Charnock. I'm a Miller Center Fellow. And I hope I can sort of pull my tangle of thoughts together about this, because it's obviously a very interesting question. But I'm always particularly struck by how the idea of the submerged state and the idea that the American state is not prevalent, because as a foreigner coming here, it seems very prevalent to me, maybe because I have to interact with them on a different basis at customs. But I guess what I was wondering is, has there been any kind of research along these lines in a comparative context? Because I could see a situation in which, say, social programs in the UK are so built into the fabric of life that you wouldn't really be aware of them. But I don't know that that would shape your attitudes to government in the same way that you're suggesting it does here, in the sense that unless you're aware of it, you're probably going to be less in favor of government. Whereas I think there can be submerged benefits in the UK that you don't necessarily notice, but you might still be in favor of government. So I'm wondering if it's sort of context dependent. Yeah. And the other thing, in terms of the delivery, when you're talking about tax benefits, and again, from my personal experience, when I earn money in the UK, which unfortunately has been rarely, but it just is taken away, and I don't file a tax form, and if I've earned not enough that year, I get some refund sort of automatically, magically from the government. I have far less control and input in